Hello, hello. Testing. No? Is it on?
Unclear.
Debbie? HH2. Testing. Yep. All right, are we ready to get started, everybody? Are we ready? I'm excited. All right, so hi everyone, my name is Micah Thomas and I'll be your host today. Good evening and welcome to Greenlight Bookstore. We are excited to host tonight's event with Paisley Currah presenting his new book, Sex Is As Sex Does, Governing Transgender Identity. He will be talking with Andrea Long Chu, so you're in for an excellent evening. Before I turn things over to them, just a couple of housekeeping things. Please turn off or silence your cell phones, and if you haven't already done so, please do it now. Please keep your mask over your mouth and nose for the time you're inside the store. Signed books are for sale at the register, and Paisley will be personalizing afterwards. The event recording will be available on YouTube, and then just a reminder, the store closes at 9 p.m. tonight. Our interviewer for the evening is Andrea Long Chu. Andrea is the book critic at New York Magazine. Her book, Females, was a finalist for the 2019 Lambda Literary Award in Transgender Nonfiction. Her writing has appeared in N+1, New York, the New York Times Magazine, The New Yorker, Book Forum, and elsewhere. She will be speaking with our featured author, Paisley Currah. Paisley is a professor of political science and women's and gender studies at Brooklyn College in the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. An award-winning author, he is the founding co-editor of the journal Transgender Studies Quarterly and the co-editor of Transgender Rights in Corpus, an interdisciplinary reader on bodies and knowledge. His new book, Sex Is As Sex Does, explores what the evolving fight for transgender rights reveals about government power, regulations, and the law. Exploring examples from different states, government agencies, and court cases, Currah reveals the hidden logics and have governed sex classification policies in the United States and shows what the regulation of transgender identity can tell us about society's approach to sex and gender at large. So you're in for something special tonight. Paisley will be reading from the book, then Andrea will join him in conversation, and you'll have the chance to ask questions after that. So please join me in welcoming to the stage Paisley and Andrea.
Thank you so much, Micah, and I'd like to thank Micah and everybody at Greenlight, including Gene and the whole crew of people. So it's really a pleasure to be at a bookstore that one shops in and be sitting here. So, I'm just going to start in. I'm going to read a little bit from the book. I'm not reading from the actual book because the book, you know, I wanted to go see you, so I have pieces of paper. So I'm going to read for a few minutes. A little bit. It's a little bit where I will be telling a story. It's a policy story, so I'm not, you know, it's not a rock and rolling narrative, but it's still a story. And then Andrew and I will have a conversation. So, okay. So in the mid-1960s, it's still not working. Now I can't see you at all. In the mid-1960s, a woman asked the New York City's Bureau of Records and Statistics to change the M on her birth certificate to an F. So she was known as anonymous. She'd done everything she was supposed to function socially as a woman. She had her gender identity affirmed by a medical professional. She'd assumed the name and role of a female and undergone gender-affirming medical care. But as long as the M remained on her birth certificate, her ability to move through the world as a woman would be compromised. So this was like the fourth and the fifth request the city had got, and they had just kind of granted the first few, not knowing what to do much. But the fourth and the fifth one, they were like, okay, we need to have a policy on this. So they turned to the New York Academy of Medicine, which is an outside group of doctors, obviously, and they asked them to make some policy recommendations. So this New York Academy of Medicine forms an ad hoc committee composed entirely of doctors. But what's interesting about this committee is it's spent a good part of its time considering the legal aspects of the change of sex. So all these doctors are thinking about what are the policy implications. The legal implications, the committee found, would include allowing marriage between a transsexual, this is the language of the committee, transsexual woman and a non-transsexual man, changing the draft status, denying or providing access to benefits, and enabling individuals to obtain passports with a new sex classification. In its report, the committee concluded that the desire of concealment of a change of sex by the transsexual is outweighed by the public interest for protection against fraud. So the Board of Health followed this committee's recommendation, and as a matter of policy, trans people would not be able to change their sex on their New York City birth certificate. And for complicated reasons that even the city's own administrative lawyers can't explain, New York City is a different birth certificate area than New York State. So over the next 5 decades, the city's policy would be amended 4 more times. So in 1971, the board ruled that the city could issue new birth certificates to trans people, but they would issue a birth certificate with no sex designation at all, like not even a box for sex designation. And even to get that, one still had to have what they called convertive surgery. And, affidavits from surgeons and the whole thing. In 2006, the city agreed to issue new birth certificates listing the reclassified sex, but still required applicants to submit evidence of sex change surgery, despite the recommendation of a committee. And this time, I was one of the folks on this committee. They, instead of turning to a bunch of medical doctors, they turned to trans health advocates and trans rights advocates. But even though we recommended something else, they still decided that people would have to have genital surgery before they would issue a new birth certificate. We had argued that transition was an individualized process, and that gender identity, not genitals, should determine sex classification. And initially, our colleagues, the bureaucrats in the Board of Health, appeared willing to adopt this recommendation to go with the gender identity. And they went so far as to promulgate this recommendation for public comment. But after a public outcry at the idea that one might transition without medical intervention, and after other city agencies weighed in against the proposal, it was withdrawn. And it wasn't until 2014 that the city council passed legislation that made it possible for people born in the city to change the sex marker on their birth certificate, so it would correspond with one's gender identity. Individuals requesting these changes in 2014, you wouldn't have to undergo any medical treatment, but you still had to have an affidavit from a doctor. Finally, in 2018, they made the policy pretty good, which is just you can choose M, F, or X, and you don't need to have any kind of medical support. So it took, between 1965 and 2018 to get the policy that, the trans advocates of today would want. But how do we think of this story of the long struggle over sex reclassification, and to what should we attribute its eventual success? From the account I just gave you, one might think that trans advocates in the city spent 5 decades arguing over the most accurate definition of sex. During my time on the advisory committee, this is back in 2005, that's what I thought was going on. For advocates, it seemed that policies adopted at various points by the government, like not allowing people to change their sex, insisting on surgery, leaving sex designation off the document altogether, limiting the categories to M or F. We thought all of these bad policies were rooted in outdated ideas about sex, even as trans people's demands changed over the decades. The city's recalcitrance was understood as at best ill-informed, or at worst, and most likely, transphobic. And yet, as the 1965 committee's emphasis on the legal aspects of sex reclassification suggests, considerations about what sex does for different governing apparatuses have often had a far bigger part in determining the rules than ideas about what sex really is. The debate over sex was in fact taking place in 2 different registers. Trans advocates made their claims in the register of expertise and truth, working from the assumption that sex reclassification policy should be based on the correct definition of sex. Representatives of the state, however, responded to those claims in the register of governing and politics. Their main concern was with the practical consequences of changing the rules. Studying the history of the process and reviewing a lawsuit later brought against New York City by a trans rights organization, by studying this, I came to the revelation that the city bureaucrats were the true Foucauldians. They understood that sex was not a thing in itself, but something instrumentalized differently by different agencies. So that's a section from the first chapter of the book. And the whole book talks about these kind of contradictions and paradoxes in sex classification, because for trans people in the United States, the sheer number of state institutions with the authority to define one's sex ensnares us in a Kafkaesque web of contradictions. So one's sex can change depending on what government agency, what court, what jurisdiction, what one is in front of, or what jurisdiction one is in. So this seems contradictory or even paradoxical if one thinks that sex is a thing in itself. But these inconsistencies do make sense. This is kind of the suspension of disbelief I'm kind of asking readers to do in this book. These inconsistencies do make sense if we understand that these different constructions of sex for their different government projects. Various state agencies do different things: regulate marriage and families, make decisions about property, track births and deaths, provide residents with identity documents, house the homeless, attend to public health, regulate the professions, ensure the security of air travel, incarcerate populations. Each agency's policy on sex reclassification therefore varies too. One's classification and the criteria for changing it has often depended on how a particular agency sees individuals, as workers, as incarcerated people, as parents, as spouses, as students, as voters, as social service clients. So that just gives you a little bit of a little short policy story, and I could go on and talk more about what happens with the rest of that story and how we move into the contemporary period. But I just wanted to tell you that because it shows you a little bit of the methodology I'm kind of using in the book. So I'll stop there and hand it off to Andrea.
Thanks for that, Paisley. Great, yeah, take some water. So I thought we could start by you and I both listing our sex markers on our various documents. That's a joke. I don't even know what they all are, actually. Paisley and I have known each other for, I think, 7 years now. I took a class of his at the Graduate Center when I was in graduate school. It was one of, I think it's because I was upset with the offerings at my own department, as one often is, and was scouring the entire consortium, which is like a bunch of different schools in the city, for like any classes on gender, and probably found what was like probably the only trans studies class in the whole, like available to graduate students in the whole city. And I think as long as I have known you, you have been writing this book.
I know, and I've been writing it for longer than I've known Andrea, but yes, at least definitely those 7 years too.
So I was wondering if you could, if we could start there with the sort of, you had, as you shared a little bit there, you had this personal experience, more than one experience of being on committees and finding that sort of what they were asking you to do was different from what they actually wanted you to do, which was to try and tell you kind of what the policy effects of would be. But I am wondering sort of what the origin of the project was for you, specifically as a book project, like when you started kind of conceiving it, and you mentioned a little about method, but kind of what connection it had to your feelings about kind of like the field of trans studies, this thing that like still may or may not exist, and the way that you wanted to kind of intervene in it.
Right. So yes, I'm certainly part of trans studies. I helped found the Transgender Studies Journal. There's other ways in which I'm sort of not, because of the kind of social science I do, because of my empirical approach. But I think in terms of thinking about the book, I was working on the New York City's non-discrimination legislation in the late 90s, early 2000s. And at one hearing, there was a trans woman testifying, and she has this really great quote. She says, "I do not suffer from gender dysphoria. I suffer from bureaucratic dysphoria. My ID does not match my appearance." And I think I put that in like 3 different articles I've written. It's probably in the book 4 times. But like that really got to me. But and what I was really interested in thinking about was like how she thinks of herself and how the state thinks of herself is different. But then the bureaucratic dysphoria, what's really fascinating is that a lot of trans activists were thinking about like, oh, the government is not seeing me, it's not recognizing me, and that's true. But then all these different agencies were seeing the same trans people differently. Either you could or you could not change your sex classification, or the requirements for changing your sex classification were different. So you might not have the right surgery in one place, but you might have the right surgery in a different place. So I was really fascinated by thinking about like, not so much the relationship between the individual and state, because that has been covered a lot in political theory and trans studies and legal theory about misrecognition. I was interested in seeing how all these different agencies classify people differently. And I think when I started to kind of get into this and unpack this, I thought, it's like, for people who write about the law, we often fall into this problem. It's like, you start writing about it and you think there's going to be some magical key that will unlock all the contradictions. You know, it's like, I'm just going to figure it out, because how could this person be all these different things? There's got to be some beautiful explanation. You know, everything's got to fit together like a perfect, you know, little puzzle. And then I realized after a while, like, that was my problem. Like, it didn't fit together in a perfect way, because I was thinking the state was a thing. Like, it was like this thing called the state. It was one thing, it did one thing. And then once I kind of moved away from that and became, you know, a bit more of a Foucauldian than I probably should have been earlier, I realized, like, this is the problem of not the problem of trans advocates, but this is the problem of trying to understand, like, unlock the keys. Like, there's all these different state authorities, and they all have the power to define sex. And literally, in administrative law, it's housekeeping. Like, now they do rules, but back then, sex wasn't a word you had to promulgate in a rule. You could just, defining it was literally housekeeping. You could just say this is what it was. Let's look at Webster's dictionary or whatever. So I think for me, once I decided to, like, let go of the idea, and then my methodological thing that I was interested in doing was like, and it occurred to me eventually, was like, stop thinking of sex as anything. I know sex is something, we all think sex is something, but like, what I decided to do was like, you know what, I'm just gonna think of the M or the F on your passport, or the zeros and ones on your social security records. I'm just gonna think of them as a thing. A decision about M or F that's backed by the force of law. That's all I know that sex is. I'm gonna move away from thinking about what it should be.
Right, right. And I think, well, so one of the things that comes across in the book is that, like, sort of the answer to the question of what sex does is that at certain points, historically, and in, you know, specific places and for specific reasons, sex was being used to distribute rights and resources. You talk about this, there's reference to this sort of, you know, infamous Nancy Fraser paper about recognition and distribution, but, you know, which we don't have to get into, but sort of the bottom line of that, it sounds like for you, was that when the state wants to just say hi to you, it's like relatively easy to change, and when it is looking to decide whether you like get stuff is when it becomes harder.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way of putting it, because the way a lot of advocates were looking at it, including myself, is like policies that made it hard for people to change their sex classification were mean or transphobic, and policies that were easy were good and non-transphobic. And like, that's useful, and that's probably true in some ways, but I want to see how like policies that harm trans people might have harmed trans people as an unintended consequence of other structures. And I also want to see policies that were nice to trans people as also not necessarily because like the police officer is nice, right? There's this thing in, I don't know, political theory or Marxist theory, the police officer says, hey you, and you turn around, right? And so that turning around is like you're being recognized. Like, police officers are recognizing you and you're being recognized in the recognition, blah, 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 it's all philosophy, I don't really do that sort of stuff. But I wanted to kind of understand that like the policies might have, like even good policies might have, for the purposes of the state, or the benefits of the state. So for example, driver's licenses. Like it's not helpful if I get pulled over and I hand over a driver's license that says F on it, because I don't look like an F, right? So the police officer's confused. So the fact that the driver's license policies were so easy, they were the first ones to change their policies. They were the first ones to drop requirements for surgery. There's still a few places that require surgery. There's a couple backsliding Republican states happening now. But like, it was in the interest of the state for us to carry out identity documents that helped us track us as we move through space. But then when things got into other policy areas that involved money, it was a different story. So yeah. Can you talk
about one of those?
Yeah, so.
The money?
Yeah, money, following money. So, you know, even in states where people could change all their documents and so on, there was all these driver's license policies were being reformed. It was pretty easy. I had a friend who was a young lawyer, and he learned there was a convention of DMV people, and he would go to it every year. And they were like just nice bureaucrats from all over the country, and they'd figure out how to do all these nice changes for trans people. So even as all these DMV policies were being changed, in those states there was these appellate decisions involving trans people in a marriage. So this is before the ban on same-sex marriage was ruled as unconstitutional. So a typical case was this one in Texas where this woman named Christy Lee Littleton was married to a guy who dies in the hospital. So there's a malpractice lawsuit, and the insurance company's lawyers are like evil and brilliant, and they're like, you know what? If we can say if we can challenge her standing to sue, we won't have to defend whatever stupid things the doctors did. So they said, you know what? She would have changed her birth certificate, she might have changed her driver's license, but she was born a man, and so for the purposes of Texas law, she remains a man, therefore it's a same-sex marriage, therefore she's not a spouse, therefore she has no opportunity to sue. So an appellate court in Texas said, you know what? That is right, because a surgeon cannot change with a scalpel what God created at birth. I mean, this is, this is Texas, so that was the language. So that would be an example. So something was an issue there. Another one was in, I get so bad mixed up, Indiana, Illinois. But anyways, it was a woman who had married a guy. The fellow died. She was a trans woman, and then the son he didn't want her to have any part of the estate. And that, and she also lost. Another one in Florida, it was a fight over custody, and the ex-wife, who was a cisgender person, was being supported by this conservative legal foundation, and this whole case was actually broadcast live on court TV in the early part of this century, like saying, this fellow is transgender, he might have changed all his documents, but he's really a woman, it's a same-sex marriage, so he has no access. Therefore, the adoptions and his parenting relationship are all void, and therefore he loses. So that's what really struck me, is that marriage is different than, marriage serves a different purpose than, say, regulating people with identity documents and tracking them through space.
Right. It's about distributing resources.
Yeah.
I want to talk about the marriage thing, but I also just want to go back to something you said about, well, maybe I won't remember it, so maybe we should just go into the marriage thing. A lot of the cases that you do talk about in the book have to do with marriage, because it's one of the sort of, it persists in formal legal terms as a place where sex is relevant. And one of the claims of the book, one of the, I think, kind of counterintuitive claims is that that the state has not become more trans-friendly, it's just become more sex-neutral. And that trans people sort of get helped out by that, but that's not necessarily the intention. And even when even when it's, activists, it's feminists and not necessarily trans advocates that are making this, that are helping make those changes happen. But of course now, Obergefell is on, is potentially under threat. And I do wonder if you see, do you see these kind of cases coming back in situations where, if it comes past that Obergefell goes away?
Yeah, that's a really good question. But let me just backtrack a little bit and just go over the argument I make about marriage, or even about transgender politics. So, transgender rights often are narrated as like an identity politics movement. Like, here's people, we gather under the sign of the umbrella, the sign of transgender, we march forward, we get rights. There's a speech that Loretta Lynch gives when she's the Attorney General a few years ago in the Obama administration that brings tears to the eyes of trans advocates about every group gets its due and arc of justice and all that sort of thing. And certainly the organization of transgender rights advocates into a legible group has been helpful, but one of the arguments I make in the book is that a lot of the policies, the obstacles that transgender people face with sex reclassification were put in place to make sure that men got more stuff than women, or basically to ensure that to maintain sex as a way to distribute resources. And over the course of the 20th century, as that, as gender sort of gets disestablished from the state, and there's less and less places where the states can treat women differently than men, that starts to kind of erode the barriers for trans people changing their sex classification. So even back in New York City, when we were meeting with these bureaucrats, this was before Obergefell. So they wouldn't say this officially in the minutes, but sometimes they would say after the meetings, our real fear is that a cisgender lesbian is going to say she's a trans man and marry her cisgender lesbian partner, and then they'll be in an opposite sex marriage, but they will just be kind of gaming the system. Like, that was their fear. That's why in 2006 they wanted people to have surgery to change their sex, because they thought, okay, if a cisgender lesbian wants to have genital surgery, that's fine. Then that's going to limit people gaming the system. But as the barriers to as second wave feminism and removing the barriers to women's equality before the law fell, then it became easier for transgender people to also kind of change one's sex classification. So it was sometimes the harm was unintended. Not that bureaucrats were really sad when trans people were hurt, but sometimes it was an unintended consequence of the classification system itself. And then with this new court, it's pretty likely that, I mean, who knows what's likely with this court, but I think we can't really go wrong imagining moving in bad directions. They'll probably start to chip away at, same-sex marriage rights in states with this little thing or that little thing around parental rights, or maybe names on birth certificates, and that could start to harm transgender people. But if they eventually say there's no, the Constitution doesn't, or it's not unconstitutional to ban same-sex marriage, then that will put trans marriages back where they were, pre-Obergefell, which was just impossible to figure out. Like, literally, try to figure out trans marriage. You can see it in the Social Security system, because when two people are married, when one dies, somebody gets survivor benefits. So that's a really good kind of place to see how these marriages were looked at. Because most marriages involving transgender people don't end up in appellate courts. They just either stay together or they dissolve more peaceably. But around benefits, when the government has money to lose, then it gets a little more tricky. So literally, the Social Security Administration would tell its field agents in this guide, they'd say, we don't really know the status of a transgender person in a marriage. Treat them as suspicious and do a lot of legal research and consult a lawyer. Because it could depend on where they were married, what gender they were when they were married, where they were both born, where they live now, where one died. Like, it could be all these things. So it was like a real kind of total, ontological chaos in terms of the status of whether trans people were opposite sex marriages. But that chaos, it's not like that cool academic chaos. You're saying, look, it's a total contradictory, chaotic mess. Isn't that great? Because usually when it's a contradictory, chaotic mess, the policymakers are just going to, the government is going to save its purse and rule in favor of the states, not paying out benefits. So I think we'll probably go back to there for sure.
Yeah. It's interesting hearing you talk. I'm reminded that one of I think the most interesting things about the book is this claim, and you've mentioned it already, but that a lot of times when the state hurts trans people, it's not trying to, not because it's being benevolent, but because it's sort of oafish and awkward, and it's a lot of people it's a lot of small-time people working small-time jobs who have contradictory instructions and are sort of just doing things in relative kind of ignorance about what someone at a different agency is doing, so there isn't it's not that there isn't harm, but the harm is not the product of some sort of grand organized form of discrimination or animus. It's something that's happening because the state is not built to deal with trans people, and because it doesn't really care about them, and because there's such a small margin. And it just, what it raises for me is this question about this is a gender studies question. I'm sorry, this is an academic question, which is that there is this assumption, right, in terms of the way that identity studies, formations have come to being in the academy, that the thing that comes before the word studies is going to be that on the basis of which the people in whose name the study is conducted suffer, right? It's like gender studies is fundamental in terms of its political meaning, is there for people who are getting hurt because of their gender. And black studies, queer studies, right, it's the same thing. And what's so interesting about this book is that you're saying, it's not actually, it is the case that it's their, it has to do with their gender, but really it has to do with with like a whole host of other things, and it kind of it thwarts the kind of nice, clean analysis of saying like, well, these things are happening to trans people because the world is transphobic or the state is transphobic, and that's like a non-answer, I think, to you.
Right. And right now, this is a weird moment to be saying like transphobia is not a very useful category of analysis. So I get that, and let me just talk about. But I do think it's useful, but I think we can kind of expand outward. So let me tell you the rest of the New York City birth certificate story. Well, the New York City birth certificate story is like you can get an MF or X with no documents. That's great, right? And Mayor de Blasio at the time, he has a press release that says, transgender New Yorkers, this is what they need, we're going to serve the needs of our community, that's all great. And so, the way I read that is like, that is transgender people as like he sees transgender people as an identity politics group, and it's a constituency, like the Democratic Party, they care a lot about the LGBT community, and as a constituency. So that's giving things to this particular group. But when babies are born in a New York City hospital, they don't do MF or X. They get M or F based on what the doctor says, right? So they're not changing the whole regime of gender based on saying, well, we don't know what their gender identity is. They're changing the regime of gender just for this group of people who might want to change it later. There's actually a few jurisdictions, California, Maine, and some of them. There's 3 that parents can't do that in the hospital. So, but what I want to suggest is like the stuff that's going on now with the blue states and the red states, the stuff in the red states is terrible and is truly transphobic, and we can talk about what purposes that serve. And the stuff in the blue states, then we think, oh, the blue states is just nirvana. It's just, this is the place to live, right? Because we have this sort of people trying to pass legislation that will help us. So for example, they're going to try to amend the New York State Constitution that will put abortion rights right in the Constitution. As they're doing that, they're going to put some pretty good language around gender recognition, which is good. But the lure of identity politics, you get caught up in these specific policies, right? Oh, let's have a non-discrimination law. Let's have identity document laws that are important, that people change their sex classification. I'm all for that. That's good. But then it suggests like that's enough, right? And that's not enough. So like the thing was like in Republican states now, they're working really hard to make life terrible for trans people, but especially trans youth. But that doesn't mean that life is great in blue states. Like that's the problem. It's kind of like the Democratic problem, right? Against Trump. It's like Trump is so evil, and therefore Biden is great. Like so we get stuck in this kind of logic where the 3 things that would help the most trans people the most would be having a good national health care plan, doing as much as we can to eradicate this insane Edwardian levels of income inequality, and prison abolition, right? But we get stuck on these not little, but these like, the identity politics logic of this bill or that bill. So that's some of gets to your question.
Yeah, and sort of, you talk about in the book a little that we get stuck on kind of justification arguments. I mean, not unlike with Trump, right? Like there's fact checking, right? They like say the experts come in and we say, well, whatever, Anne Fausta Sterling, there are 4 different sexes or 8 different, however many she has now, and or because of these various like, oh, biology isn't that simple, or it's socially constructed. Like there's this need to sort of it's like trying to defend yourself to a playground bully. Like you look like you become the the stupid person in being called, in responding to it as if it was like a real thing instead of as like a tactical move.
Right.
Politics.
Yeah, absolutely. And like litigators have to do that kind of tactical move. They got to bring out the experts and establish their credentials and say this or that to Trump-appointed judges. They can be very effective. But I think there's a larger question in terms of it as a movement. Like, we don't need to have a theory of gender. Like, it's a mistake to get drawn into these ontological battles with what sex is and what gender is. Like, like, the right wing would love us to have us there, right? Because they would draw into this battle, this definition battle. They're not doing it in good faith. They're just going to say whatever works in that particular moment with that judge or that focus group or that, Twitter, feed. They're not doing it in good faith, but we're like drawing up people and saying this is what sex is, and sex is that, and sex is this, instead of like looking at the larger effects of their policies. So instead of fighting over like definitions of sex, what I've been saying, what I would suggest that we focus on like the policies themselves and the harm they do, right? Like and instead of saying what's a boy, what's a girl, how are we going to decide that? Say, look what this policy is doing to this kid, this trans boy in Alabama. Instead of like worrying about like our theory of gender is better than the right wing's theory of gender, because I think we can go the wrong route there. And one of the things I think that is good about the transgender rights movement, which I'm part of, so my critique of it is as an insider. When cisgender lefty bros critique it, I get very huffy and I don't like that. So this is all from inside. This is all from inside. But I just think we need to kind of not fall into these identity games.
Yeah. And so I want to open it up for questions pretty soon here, but I think I wanted to end with just asking you. You say it's a strange time to be asking us to think beyond transphobia, because we are in this moment, right, where like it's becoming the quiet part is becoming loud or whatever, that it's like very, very open in a way that does actually feel historically new, and I don't think that means, and I know you don't think either, that analysis is wrong, but the question it raises is like, okay, if because we know, right, like there's just trans people are such a tiny part of the population. Like there's obviously, I think one of the ways you and I have said this before, talking to each other, is that we're like good at showing how like putatively neutral things are transphobic, like we as scholars or as activists or whatever. And what we're not as good at is showing the more neutral thing that's behind transphobia. Like what is the thing inside of the transphobia that is actually more meaningful to them than than these people who have never met and will almost certainly will never meet a trans person. So like I'm curious what you think, or what you read on the new sort of this new wave of anti-trans legislation and rhetoric. Sort of like, what do you think that's like about?
I know. I think we all need to be kind of thinking hard about that. And certainly we can say it's about transphobia, but that's just like a statement and then we're done, right? So we need to think about like, what is this legislation doing? Like, what is it doing for Republicans? Like, I've been doing all these these podcasts and radio things in different parts of the state, and I was doing one in Utah, and I was looking at that Utah legislation. So Utah passed a sports bill in March. It was terrible. It basically said trans girls can't play sports. This really would be terrible for the state if a 12-year-old trans girl was on an intramural volleyball team. And the governor of Utah vetoed it. And his veto was overridden, but his veto statement was really moving. He said, I looked into this, and I figured there are 75,000 kids in elementary and high school that we're talking about, and there are 4 trans kids, and one of those is a girl, and no issues have been raised about her. And so this whole bill is directed at one girl, and no one's even upset about her playing. There hadn't even been an issue. And I think that was coming from a Republican. But I think it's like, so we need to kind of like understand that it is about attacking trans people, but like we need, and this is going to be what I'm going to be working on in my new book, but everybody should be thinking about it. We have to kind of figure it out, like what's at stake when they're trying to kind of maintain this sort of the sanctity of the gender binary. Like you can't change your gender. Like partly certainly it's related to the attack on abortion rights, because the attack on abortion rights is an attack on pregnant people, but it's also trying to bring back, a gender hierarchy. It's mostly going to harm. It's going to harm pregnant people, but most of the people it's going to harm are women. So it's bringing back this hierarchy, and so part of what's going on, I think, of course, is to kind of maintain, it's not just the hierarchy, but the distinction between men and women. But I think we all need to see how these kinds of policy agendas are someone said I used immigrated like 4 times in my book, so I won't say that word. But how these policy agendas are like woven into other things. But I also think we need to think about how the policy agendas in New York State are woven into things. Like, it's great we're going to maybe change the Constitution, have this gender recognition built in. But what about homelessness per se? What about the incarceration? So one of the things that transgender rights groups often will say is that because transgender people face discrimination in employment, they're more likely to go to jail and they're more vulnerable to incarceration. And there's probably some truth in that. And there's all this kind of advocacy around this bad situation that transgender prisoners are in. But some of that advocacy gives the impression that cisgender prisoners are just doing fine. Like, everything is great. So transgender prisoners mostly don't get the gender-affirming health care they need. There's a few exceptions, but mostly they don't. But cisgender prisoners are getting Advil for cancer, so they're also not getting the care they need. So I think we just, as much as possible, like not get totally sucked into this logic of one particular group and think more like of these larger structures. So even in places like New York State.
Oh, great. On that note, I mean, I have more things I can ask, but I think let's open it up to questions. I'll bring the mic around. Yeah?
Is that Darren?
I am.
Oh, it's hard to see with the mask. Yes.
I know. And my hair is different. Thank you both, and thanks so much, Andrea, for the, bringing out all these important issues in the book. I'm curious about 2 things. So I've argued in some of my work that the state is not so neutral about sex, or not as neutral as it should be, which you would probably also agree with. But I'm curious about the pushback that you've gotten, which Andrea referenced, on your assertion that that transgender folks have benefited from the state's shift toward more neutrality. So why is that a controversial statement?
Well, so in the book I make this argument. I didn't talk about too much today, but like, as the state got more gender neutral, not as gender neutral as it should be, the sex classifications that were baked in there had less consequences. Right. So judges and policymakers were a little chilled out, became a little more chilled out about letting people change their sex classification, and that just like not really acknowledged sometimes. We pretend it's all about the strength of the transgender rights movement. So I don't think I've gotten tons of pushback, but I do think there's a way in which the transgender rights movement is narrated as like this kind of pulls itself up by its own bootstraps, and I want to see how it's implicated with second-wave feminism, for good and for bad. But I think there was a second part to your question.
No, I think that's it.
Okay.
But thank you. That's all. More questions?
Thank you. So this is I'm a religion scholar, so that's where this is coming from. But it was interesting that you mentioned this. The thing like Texas being like you can't change what God designated at birth, and I think like it's fair to say the current Supreme Court is very amenable to conservative deployments of religion, and I'm just interested in how you see that kind of intersecting with this whole idea of state bureaucracy. To what extent sort of religious justifications are used, and also if you think there's a hope of like fighting back on those terms. I'm thinking of like, I know there's some Jewish groups that are trying to fight back against the overturning of Roe versus Wade by saying it's like it's a matter of Jewish religious freedom to be able to conduct abortions. So do you think there's anything comparable or similar, or just how do you see religion relating to any of this in general?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I was just reading today some piece by Jenny Sook in the New Yorker about that very point about abortion. I mean, I come at the Supreme Court sort of as like in terms of doctrine, I'd just be Grandma Moses, like I don't know it and I don't believe in it. I think doctrine is like Santa Claus. So, like doctrine is for clerks, and the judges are going to do whatever they want to do, and somebody has to write something that sounds pretty. So I think that with the Supreme Court, definitely it's certainly true that like Justice Gorsuch and a bunch of people are going to like take any non-discrimination law and drive trucks through it with these religious exemptions. And it would be nice if they said, so they're going to make it possible to discriminate against, LGBT people based on religion. And it'd be nice if there was like some internal coherence and they said, oh yeah, so Jewish people believe life begins at birth, so they certainly should have the right to. I don't think they'll do that though. Because I think the thing is, and I think other people maybe can speak more better on this in terms of doctrine, but I just don't believe that they really adhere to their doctrine when they don't want to. I feel like everything's reverse engineered. So because we can't necessarily expect coherence. The only coherence we can expect from them is to like adopt whatever the Republican, the extreme right Republican wants them to adopt. But it's a good question.
Hey, it's Jamie, your neighbor. You talked a little bit about how like gender is becoming a less relevant category as like a legal category, and in the book you talk a little bit about also like at the same time that that's happening, gender identity is becoming sort of ascendant as like a category, like instead of the authority of like who is trans coming from like medical intervention, it's coming from this new formulation of gender identity. And I've been thinking a lot about like, obviously it's weird for like the state to certify your gender through like doctors and expertise, but there's also something that feels weird to me, at least in relation to my own gender, of like the state demanding that I make a claim that there's like a true self within me and that it has to do with this vague thing called gender identity that like the state is now involved in. And I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about like if you see there being any kind of repercussions of like, I don't know, is it new that the state is involved in this question, and also like are there going to be consequences down the road in terms of like what does it mean for like a true gender that one must certify for the state?
Yeah, no, that's a super good question. So I was working on this book for a long time. And for a long time I was working on it, I was kind of doing sort of like the neoliberal theory critique. Is like gender is not really, they don't really care, it's not going to matter. Like we will eventually move gender out of identity documents. I mean, people sort of expect it, but eventually maybe we'll move that way. And then we've got this resurgence of a certain kind of like, right-wing fundamentalism around gender as this fundamental organizing principle of society. So I see like we might go in two different directions in terms of like different, political jurisdictions. But I was talking on the radio, some conservative guy from New Hampshire was like, so why do you think the government, why are you trying to get people to change, why do you have to, what was his question? Why do you think we should get government out of the business of sex classification? And it's not exactly what I say, but I was like, but I was going to go for it. I was like, well, Bert, do you want the government to tell you what your gender is? You know your gender. You don't need the government to tell you what it is. You don't need to bring a bunch of pieces of paper to some government officials for your gender. He was like, oh yeah. So that's like a libertarian argument, and I don't know if it would hold up, analytically.
More questions? Oh, I saw that one first.
Thank you so much.
Hello. So I was interested in your point earlier about how you think it's more effective for the trans movement to focus on the harm that's caused by ostensibly transphobic policies rather than by litigating the ontological nature of gender. And that critique resonated with me. I've always thought it's kind of problematic how the movement invests so much energy into litigating like the nature of gender and sometimes falling into the trap of like of almost reinforcing cisnormative ideas about what gender is, understanding gender as this fixed thing. But my reaction to that when you brought that up is, how do you make a salient case that a policy should be disavowed because it's harmful to trans people when the humanity and the dignity of trans people is never factored into the equation in the first place?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. And the thing is, I don't really say, like, some of my best friends would disavow me if I did, that litigators should not be like using whatever arguments they can in a particular case. Like in the Alabama case, where they turned providing gender-affirming care to a felony, they got a Trump appointee as a judge. Didn't seem good. And then the Trump judge said, after all these experts came in about gender, said, you know what? This policy is not good. I'm going to, whatever they do, put a preliminary injunction on or whatever, because it's interfering with the right of the parents to work with the doctors to provide the best health care for their kid. So it was like a 14 amendment, substantive due process right. And so it was really effective, and it did depend on expert witnesses talking about like gender identity is not something that should be legislated from the state, but it's something that adheres in an individual. So when I talk about moving away from getting these ontological battles, I think we need to think about that as a movement. But I think the main point of your question about like they don't even care about the respect and dignity of these people, I think we have to kind of situate these people, us transgender people and non-binary people, as like, as workers, as family members, as kids, as children. Like we need to kind of, and that does resonate when they see people in those situations, because it's interesting with these terrible bills and they're being litigated. These trans kids aren't all in Brooklyn, right? They're all over the country, and they're born in these sometimes evangelical families who would probably have a gender reveal party, and then over time they are fierce advocates for their kids, right? So we need to kind of see that, like, in some sort of local context, these kids have support, and that's not always true, I know, but we all need to not kind of write off the support that they get from their churches and their families and their local healthcare providers, and just turn it into the transgender rights movement against Alabama. So I think that's what I would say to that.
Yeah, could you talk a little bit more? The book is called Sex Is as Sex Does, and you made a deliberate choice to use the word sex as opposed to gender, and why you did that, and then when you do use the word gender, are you intending to mean something different from when you use the word sex, in the title and in the book?
Yeah, so I decided to make sex as like an effect, or like an output. So sex is literally defined in the book. And I don't really know what sex is, so I just said in the book, I'm gonna say it's a government decision backed by the force of law. And so gender is not defined in the book. It's defined, gender just refers to all these like traditional and maybe not so traditional ideas about like men and women and normative arrangements and histories and traditions. So often it's gender that's driving these sex classification policies. But I just wanted to kind of, my way of looking at that question was not to try to figure out like what is gender, what is sex, and what's the relation between it. I would look at what is the government doing. It's using sex as a tool of governmentality, so I'm just going to define it that way. And it's gender that mostly provides the ideological kind of force to those decisions a lot of the time. But that's not what I wanted to talk about.
We have one more time.
Thank you so much, Paisley. So my question has to do with the role of bureaucrats. So you mentioned how this book really challenges us to think beyond transphobia and to think about how, as you said before, the harm that's done is often because the state is oafish. So I was thinking, in light of transphobic columns like the New York Times Pamela Paul post, like how do you reconcile bureaucrats who may believe the same things that she does, and their role in bureaucracy? Where does the bureaucrats start in the bureaucracy?
Yeah, no, that's a super good question. And maybe I paint bureaucrats too benign sometimes, but what I'm thinking of is just like public health officials. These are like medical doctors who like make no money, but they make a lot less money than they would in the private sphere. They're not necessarily bad people. When a bunch of us were talking to New York State birth certificate people, like in the early part of this century, they were like, well, we have this policy, you can't change your sex, but we have people who want to change their sex, and we just say the doctor made a mistake on the birth certificate and then change it. That wasn't a policy that was written down, but that was their policy. They hadn't figured out. They could just, they would tell us at the meeting. But so I'm not so much interested in like nasty bureaucrats, but back in the day, there was a total, before the internet somehow, there was this total kind of trans lifeline of like which clerk and which DMV and which county to go to, or how to do it. Like sometimes trans men who were sort of, non-binary or binary would just go, hey, look at this, I have an F on my license. And they'd be like, that's great, let me change it. So there's like lots of that kind of like folk wisdom that went around there. But what I'm interested in now is like how like it used to be a bureaucratic decision that might harm trans people, but looking at these, and I didn't read all the quotes, but some of the stuff from the 1960s, these federal bureaucrats are asked about it. They're like, huh? They weren't foaming at the mouth. Oh, that's so weird. They were like, huh? That's interesting because it would change, it would change national service and it would change benefits. They were just kind of thinking like technocrats. But the problem now, though, is that it's moving out of this sort of slightly quiet, benign, sort of sometimes benign bureaucratic sphere, where trans people do tons of policy stuff behind the scenes, into this very visible political sphere of legislatures of Democrats and Republicans. Like I have a long quote, it's probably too long, it's like so long quote in one chapter, but it's just a hearing where Republicans in some southern state are considering to change whether or not they're going to change their birth certificate law, which they aren't. But it's just about their incredulity about how crazy this is. So I think the problem is that now that it's moved out of the level of sort of technocratic competence, sometimes it's moved into this really been weaponized in the political sphere. Like that's a challenge that the trans community has got to rise to. And we've traditionally, like gay rights movement too, and myself, have been scared of democracy, like thinking the courts would be a good place to go. But we all know that that's not going to happen. So we have to just get over it and try harder.
I think we have time.
Hi, Paisley. Sorry, I was kind of hopping between two books. But having worked through some of the book and having followed your work for a very long time, what I appreciate is you have always showed us how the working of courts and the working of law is messy. Like, and sort of very interscalar approach to thinking about some of these decisions and the way it operates at multiple levels. So there is no one, story around the law and gender identity and sexist governmentality. I really appreciate that. What I was going to ask you is more of a broader question of how you see this body of work, conjoining with broader legal theory around sex and gender, and in a transnational scope. Because like a lot of the decisions are cited by different courts, each other, and my work in South Asia, we're in a very different landscape where the law is like, yeah, we want to give you rights, but we're trying to figure out how and who to recognize, as a different kind of governmentality that is happening. Like, there's positive recognition that brings re-regulation of gender identity, right? So I'm just curious as to how all of this we can think together in a broader sort of theoretical framework around governmentality and sex and law.
Yeah, no, I think that's kind of really, really crucial. Because then my book only deals with the United States, and I think that's important because I see it as like a local empirical problem, and there's so much of queer theory, like how Jasmine Report puts it, like queer theory sees like, in some ways queer theory is a colonial project. Like it has the theory and like, the former colonized countries are like the empirical place to kind of work out the theory. And I think that we need to actually kind of move away from those sorts of logics, and I'm especially distrustful or tired of, and you see it in so many like trans 101 things. We introduce transgender subjects by referring to like other times and other cultures, and this kind of this nod to the universality of gender nonconformity is like, well, there's like everything is different everywhere at every time. Like even from different neighborhoods in Brooklyn. Like I mean, so to suggest that like, oh, we know that there was transgender people because there was Hijra people in in India, that's sort of, I think we kind of need to move away from those kind of like like exporting those kind of exporting moves. But in terms of like thinking things through together, I've been really interested in, I've been rereading Jenna Haley's Taking a Break from Feminism, which is a great book. But I'm actually in the moment of taking a break from queer theory. Like I think you have to take a break from the intellectual architecture of your graduate years. You know what I mean? So she want to take a break from feminism, I want to take a break from queer theory. But one of the things I think she does a really good job of doing is always argue against what she calls convergentism. Like we want to think like we're against homophobia and transphobia and racism and sexism and colonization, like, we're all on the same page all the time. And like, that's not true, like, that's not right, you know? And the chapter in my book that talks about like the prison industrial complex and incarceration talks about how like, there's ways in which trans politics plays into the politics of incarceration. So I don't know if that exactly answers your question, but I want to move away from any kind of global, I didn't mean global in terms of the world, but any kind of universal, all these things fit together in a peace against oppression. Sort of,
We are at time here, so thank you, Paisley.